We're now going to examine the issue of coaching from the point of view of the care and growth leadership model. In the first instance, the issue of coaching obviously relates to the problem of empowerment. And when we examined empowerment, what we discovered is that there are actually three variables at issue when you're empowering somebody. First of all, it's about giving somebody the means to do what's required of them. Then it's about making somebody able to do what's required of them. And then it's about holding the person accountable. The issue of coaching refers specifically to the development of ability. It is not appropriate to deal with accountability issues as a coach. Further to this, when one considers the difference between coaching and mentoring, it's important to bear in mind that there are two critical variables that affect somebody's performance. The one is their ability to do what's required of them, and the second is the intent whereby they do it. Now, coaching generally tends to be more concerned with the ability part of that problem, and mentoring is more concerned with the intent part of that problem, although there's clearly a continuum between the two. And finally, any coaching relationship will tend to become more of a mentoring relationship over time. The most significant contribution that the care and growth model does to the discipline of coaching becomes apparent when one considers the difference between the Tony and the Fred interaction that we've indicated before. Tony is unlikely to be happy with me if I said to him, "Tony, in 1980 I did what you have to do now, and what I did worked. Don't argue with me, shut up and do what I did." And the reason why he's unhappy with me is that he'd feel that I'd be compelling him. Fred, on the other hand, would be far happier with me if I said to him, "In 1980 I did what you have to do now, and what I did worked. It may be helpful to you, take a look at it." Because in a sense that felt more persuasive. When we examined the difference between these two interactions, however, it became apparent that you can't just account for the difference between Tony and Fred's response to me on the basis of how compulsive or persuasive my behavior was. You had to cut deeper than that. You had to separate means and ends. And you had to put into those two categories either the person who's doing the job or the job that's being done. When we examine the Tony interaction, for example, if I say to him, "I did what you have to do and it worked, don't argue, do what I did," it becomes absolutely apparent that my end is to get the job done, and I'm using Tony as my means to get that job done. In the Fred interaction, however, if I sincerely said to him, "I did what you did have to do now, but it worked, take a look at it," then clearly we could have a completely different outcome from what I had in 1980. It might even be a disaster. So my end in this case isn't necessarily to get the job done. My end is actually to teach Fred something. And I'm using the job that he's doing as the opportunity to teach him something. So there's an inversion of means and ends. That inversion of means and ends allowed us to make a point about the difference in the intent in the two interactions. If we asked ourselves who Tony experienced as the beneficiary of the interaction, clearly he would think that it was me. I was trying to get something out of him. Whereas Fred would experience himself as the beneficiary of the interaction. We argued that that distinction was the distinction between managing and leading. We also went further. We said that distinction is also the difference between managing and coaching. A manager uses people as his means whereby he gets a job done and achieves a result. A coach can't afford to view his role from that point of view. If the coach said to the team, "My job is to achieve a result and get a job done, and I'm going to use you as my tools to do that," they'd probably get very disgruntled. In fact, it's the team's job to produce a result and get the job done. The coach's job is to instruct or coach the team. But that doesn't mean to say that the job or the result is irrelevant from the coach's point of view. Clearly, he can't coach a game he's not watching, but he uses the job and the results as his means in order to coach the person. That suggests that when you're busy coaching somebody, there's a significant shift of your attention from the result that you're trying to achieve and the job that the person's doing to a change in the competency of the person. So what becomes reportable in a coaching relationship is progress against a learning objective, and the task that it's being done is the means to achieve that end. This shift of using the task as the means whereby you achieve a change in the competency of the person is the key to what coaching is from a care and growth point of view. And to explore what this means practically, I'd like to examine the relationship between a foreman and the engineer that he reports to in a manufacturing environment. And what we're going to do in this instance is we're going to see how the engineer can use the job that the foreman is doing as a means in order to enable the competency of the foreman. Now, in the first instance, the engineer has to get two key things separate in his mind. He's got to understand what the learning opportunity is for the foreman, and he's got to understand the routine task that the foreman does. So let's assume he examines this problem and he establishes that the foreman has two key things that he has to learn. He's got to develop his ability to plan, and he's got to develop his ability to discipline the people reporting to him. Now, the sorts of things that the foreman does on a routine basis would be the things listed here. It would be things like, reading a breakdown report, checking the maintenance schedule, etc., etc. What's very important in this, though, is that the engineer has to look at the routine task that the foreman does from the point of view of that routine task being a gymnasium that has got bits of apparatus in it. And each one of those bits of apparatus could potentially help him to develop the strength that he's trying to develop in the foreman. Now, when one looks at this issue from that point of view, what is immediately apparent is that the end of what the engineer is trying to achieve is to develop the foreman's ability to plan and discipline, and the job that the foreman does on a routine basis becomes the means that the engineer is going to use in order to achieve the end of shifting the foreman's ability both with regard to planning and disciplining. That shift of attention from using the foreman as the means to get a job done to using the job as the means to enable the foreman would in the first instance indicate a complete shift in what normally gets attention. If one assumed that the relationship between the foreman and the engineer was consistent with most reporting relationships, then what would normally get attention from the engineer were those bits of things that directly impacted on the engineer's sense of the job that needed to get done. So on a routine basis, the engineer would have contact with and give attention to the morning meeting that he would have with the foreman and the production manager to discuss priorities, the task list that the foreman would complete for the engineer, and the reports on work completed at the end of a working day. However, what we're arguing here is that when the engineer is acting as a coach, what gets his attention isn't just the current reporting relationship, it's the developing of the competency of the foreman. And we've indicated two key competencies that the foreman needed to develop. The first was with regard to planning. If the engineer viewed the routine task that the foreman did as a gymnasium to get at the foreman's planning muscle, if you like, then what would get the engineer's attention in the routine job that the foreman did would be very different things from what would normally get his attention. Because the things that affect the foreman's ability to plan would be things like reading a breakdown report, checking the maintenance schedule, attending a morning meeting, checking on work in progress, setting priorities for breakdowns, taking a call on critical breakdowns, doing a floor walk to check work in progress, all of those things that would affect the planning of the job. So if the engineer wanted to develop the foreman's ability to plan, he would look at those bits in the foreman's workday that actually affected his planning, and he would consider how planning things better would affect those jobs. That means that he's quite literally using the job that the foreman's doing as the gymnasium to develop the foreman's planning muscle. So what becomes reportable between the engineer and the foreman, if the engineer was trying to develop the foreman's ability to plan, is the foreman's progress against his planning requirement, and the bits of the routine job that the foreman does that put pressure on the issue of planning would be highlighted in terms of the conversation between the foreman and the engineer. If the engineer specifically highlights the elements of the routine task that the foreman does in order to help the foreman develop his ability to plan, we indicated that the next learning need of the foreman was the ability to discipline. And if the engineer wanted to develop the foreman's ability to discipline, he would, in this instance, emphasize all the elements in the foreman's task that affect his ability to discipline. So it is when the foreman checks on work in progress, when he meets with artisans to assign work, when he reassigns work to artisans, when he does a floor walk to check on progress, when he deals with a disciplinary inquiry, and when he receives reports from artisans on work in progress. Similar to the issue of planning, if the engineer were to be coaching the foreman's ability to discipline, then what would become reportable would become the progress of the foreman's learning need to discipline people, and all the bits in the foreman's job that put pressure on the disciplining of people would be the material that the engineer would use in order to develop the foreman's ability to discipline. The elements of the foreman's routine task that are highlighted that relate to discipline would therefore be the things that the engineer would watch, just like a coach watches the elements of a game, to give him the material to see whether the foreman is actually disciplining people properly, and would also help him to be able to instruct the foreman in order to be able to discipline people properly over time. So again, the engineer uses the routine task that the foreman does as his means to enable the foreman's ability to discipline. Now, a final point about this is that when the leader shifts his focus from the routine task that's being done and the results that are being done to the development of a learning opportunity, what he's actually doing is he's gaining key leverage on performance, because it becomes apparent that in addressing the foreman's ability to discipline people, what the engineer actually achieves has an impact on a number of things which the foreman does, and that then obviously has a profound impact on performance. When you develop a learning opportunity, you are actually gaining really profound leverage on performance. What you need to do now is you need to do a shifting focus task for at least 3 people reporting directly to you, where in the first instance you need to identify the person's learning opportunity, and then you need to identify the routine task that the person does on a day-to-day basis, and then you need to identify the bits of the routine task that are actually going to put pressure on the person's learning opportunity.